On my very first trip in the United States back in 2005, it was abundantly clear that everybody was for buying a house. They considered it a big chunk of their nest egg, and they say that is the source of wealth. Well, back then, the rents were probably more than the actual mortgage payment, so of course that made sense. We don't need to do any math about it. But since things have changed, and this is what I want to dig into a little bit, because I had this conversation with my very good friend slash mentor about a month ago at this point. I gave it a lot of thought. I came with some arguments that I wasn't very convinced from the answers I got. So that's why I decided to make an example and see really what do you miss if you buy a house versus rent with the way mortgages are right now, all the expenses you have to do for a home. And what do you gain possibly if you invest the difference between the rent and the mortgage? So the video today, we're going to explore that. Let's see. I found this example on Redfin. I love Redfin because it gives you really everything in the payment. So first time home buyer, really at 3.5% down. That home was built in 1981. So it's older than me. It's getting harder to find that. Now that home, I didn't go all the way back to its purchase history. Well, we can go back to 81, but I didn't want to do that. I said, okay, 2000 and on. In 2000, it was sold for $123,500. In October 4th, 2016, it was purchased for $277,000. So over $150,000 more. So it over doubled in value. But in this, we have to account inflation. And inflation is because when it comes to inflation, we see that $123,000 in 2016 money was $172,000, which really means that we only gained it's still a lot, but $104,000, almost $205,000, which is a 61% increase. 61% sounds a lot, but keep in mind that 61% is in 35 years, which if we divide is 1.75 almost a year. So didn't even keep up with the inflation. Now that same home was sold again, or is for sale actually right now, August 7th. In 2024 for $430,000, which means that these people are trying to make about $160,000 roughly. But the problem is that 277 that they bought it in 2016 right now is $363,000 almost, which means that they're only getting about $67,000, $67,400, which is 19.5% increase. And that is obviously for only 8 years. But keep in mind that I have yet to talk to a homeowner that didn't have any issues with their home. They didn't feel like they need to upgrade something. The friend and mentor that I mentioned earlier, he owns his house since 2006, and from 2006 to now, he spent over $120,000 replacing windows, roof, upgrading kitchen, and he went cheap, the cheapest he could. If you try to go any fancy, $200,000 easy to do this kind of things. I have another friend from my previous job. She bought a house in this area, and within a year, she had to replace the roof, and a little later, she had to replace the windows, because keep in mind that the way everything goes up, everybody was trying to jump and get a deal, thinking that this will continue forever, and this is where we are right now. So these numbers that I'm saying don't include any maintenance, any unforeseen things, or any upgrades. So once you factor all these in, these numbers look a whole lot worse. For my friend, it looked a whole lot worse than this one. And he was actually negative to what he invested. Now, if I wanted to fund this house with an FHA loan, I'm looking at 7.05% interest, which means that basically my down payment with 3.5% would be $15,050, and then the closing cost is about a little over $17,500. And if I add these two, I am at $32,688 just to get the key in my hands. And from that point on, and again, Redfin is great showing you all this, because the principal and interest alone would be $27.75. But if I add everything in, HOA and all this good stuff, taxes, I'm looking at $36.15. Okay, $3,615. Which means that $3,615 times 360 months, which is 30 years, is $1,400,000. So roughly 1.3 million. The house is 430, but I'm gonna end up paying $1,300,000. The difference between the two is $871,000. Okay, so on top of the 430, I'm gonna pay $871,000. The other problem that nobody talks about, or very few people talk about, is the amortization of these loans, which means how interest heavy they are their first years. And banks are very good keeping their money, making sure that they get paid first before you pay off your house. And in this scenario, and in other scenarios that I've seen from other videos, but these are my numbers, you're not paying more interest than debt until year 21. So you need to be in that house for at least 21 years before you start paying more on your principal than interest. All this time you've been paying more interest than principal. And by that time, in 21 years, you still have $229,000 on your mortgage, on principal. The interest alone is $605,000. And keep in mind that you don't get anything until you sell. And if you sell, you come back to the problem of, where do you live? You need to live somewhere. Unless you're a camper, I don't know. But yeah, you don't get any money until you sell. And if you sell earlier than 21 years, you're going to get only a fraction of your money back. And I don't know how many people you know that in this day and age stay in a home for over 20 years. Most people I know, most people at my job, they moved at least 4 times the past 20 years. Some the past 10 years. So for most people today, it doesn't even make sense just because the amount of times they move. But let's say that I was to rent that same house. I went and I found houses in the area that were the same neighborhoods, even bigger, 2,000 square foot instead of that 1,500 square foot home. And the rent is $2,500. $2,500. Which means if I subtract $2,500 of the $3,615, I'm left with $1,115, $1,115. I'm gonna put a down payment on my 401k instead of a down payment on the house of the same amount, $32,688. And then every month, instead of paying the home, I'm gonna be paying the rent. And the balance I'm going to be putting in my 401k, both tax deductible. 401k and home payments are both tax deductible, at least in the state I am in Maryland. So it doesn't make any difference. That would give me in 30 years $1,844,000, almost 45. If my company has a match and I add that match into all this, and my company offers 3%, at 100% up to the first 3%, and then 50% for the next 2%. So basically, it's coming to, with that $100,000 example of home income, it's coming to $1,490 a month that you could be investing, which means that you would have $2,354,000, which is a lot of money in case you missed the memo. But now you will say, oh, but the house will continue appreciating in 30 years. It won't cost $430,000, and you're completely right. We go back to the example that we had from before. We know that in 35 years, 1981 to 2016, it appreciated 61%. I'll be fair and I'm going to say it's going to appreciate 61%. And I'm not going to add anything for maintenance all these years. I'm not going to add any issues, any upgrades, anything. I'm just going to say 61% in your pocket. So that $430,000 is now $693. How does that compare to investing the balance? Well, in the first scenario where we just invest the balance without any company match, we're looking at $1,152,000 difference. So all this time you're living somewhere, you're paying rent, you don't own. Okay, so in the end, you got nothing to show, but you have 1.1, almost 1.2 million in your 401k. And in the second scenario, where the company matches, you have on top, you have $1,662,000 when you subtract that 2.3 from that 2.3 million, the $692,000. So I know that home ownership is something very emotional. I know for a fact because my wife keeps telling me that she can't wait until we buy a home and we get in and we do whatever we want with it and we paint it the colors that she wants and we decorate it the way we want and we make the front yard, the backyard, whatever. But at the same time, I make the numbers with what's today in the market. Maybe tomorrow this will change. Maybe interest rates will go low. Maybe the home prices will go back to normal, which I doubt. But let's say that this happens. Then in that case, if we compare apples to apples, rent is close to a mortgage payment, I will always go for the mortgage payment, even if it's a little more. Because the main argument back in the day was that mortgage payment is, even if you see it as just hitting inflation rates and growth, it's a forced savings method. So you need to live somewhere. You might as well pay a mortgage. And this way you have something left in the end. And if you sell, you have some equity. Whatever that equity is, it's better than zero. And I agree. But that's when rents were the same or less than a mortgage payment. And this is not the case anymore. But that's all for today, guys. Let me know what you think. Do you own a house? Do you want to buy a house? Would you rather invest some in stocks, in bonds, in I don't know what, 401ks, maximize your 401k, get an IRA, a Roth IRA, instead of buying a home, if the difference is that, or you still want to buy a home because that's what makes sense for you mathematically or emotionally. Thank you so much for watching. Until the next one. Ciao.